Okay, we'll go live in 10 seconds.
Okay, great.
You're live. Okay, hi. Hi, Anjana. Welcome to the Unlearning series from ishield.ai. Um, and I'm Kesavan, co-founder and CEO of ishield.ai. And we are building assistive technologies to help with inclusive communications. Um, uh, Anjana holds the Omura Saxena Professorship in Responsible AI at the Broad College of Business. Professor Susarla has given several invited talks at industry and academic events and has been a commentator on algorithmic bias and digital transformation. She has been interviewed in and had her op-eds and research quoted and published in several media outlets, such as the Associated Press, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, BBC, Business Insider, Business Standard, CBS, etc. I'm super excited to talk to Anjana in about actually building trust in assistive AI technologies and what goes into actually building trust in these systems. Welcome, Anjana.
Great having this conversation with you.
Thank you. So one of the things about assistive technologies to help with communication is about working with communication that are not rule based. So, for example, grammar or spelling is more rule based. But if you want to talk about inclusion, it's more contextual. So, I would like to get a sense in terms of AI and the progress that has happened in AI that makes it possible to develop these kind of context aware systems. Can you touch upon that, Anjana?
Yeah. So I would say that one of the absolutely wonderful developments has been some of these things like the large language models and the fact that with deep learning and other methods that exist and all these new kind of frameworks, we are able to understand context and we are able to infer meaning without actually having a grammarian or a professor of English telling us the rules of the language. So I would say it's, if you look at the history of artificial intelligence, there was at one time the so called expert systems. And the expert systems were based on the idea that we can just program the rules of language or rules of anything. And that would require thousands and thousands of rules and codifying all that stuff. What are we doing now with current generation of AI? We don't need any of those rules. We have these very large scale sort of general purpose technologies almost, which are just learning meaning by association between the words, right? So very famous example, even word to vec, which is not even as advanced as some of uh, the DALIs or the GPTs of the world. What can word to vec do? It learns some association like man minus woman plus king equals queen, right? So just the fact that we're able to infer context without actually getting thousands of people writing all the rules, I think that is really how we have so much AI in conversational space and chatbots and all that stuff. But the downside of it may be that maybe it's not exactly a downside. We need to learn to use AI in a responsible manner. The challenges will be that sometimes you would have these so-called algorithmic bias, which is more of training data bias, and the all these like well-known problems where you get like a gender biased search results or racial bias or other kinds of things like that.
if what's in the data is what comes out
Yeah,
uh, in the AI.
yeah,
I get that. Other aspect about assigning or building a context-aware system is in an enterprise context, there is just not only text content, right?
yeah,
You have more multimedia content. So you have a marketing campaign where you have an image and a text, or
yeah,
you have a video, and you have a description.
Yeah.
So, what kind of developments have happened where we could take a shot at multimedia processing, where you can look at in context from an overall campaign perspective?
Yeah, I think the issue of sort of like an inclusive image search or inclusive communication, it's only we are just getting into it sort of right now. And there are tremendous amount of advances in AI, which I would call it like visual listening, because people are talking about brands. If you're if you're one of the companies that needs to, consumer facing organization, and you need to have finger on the pulse and you need to know what people are talking about you, they are not going and writing long posts on some blog or WordPress or something and you can mine all that textual content. What people are doing is they're going and making TikTok videos, or they are posting on some Instagram, or I think one of the very senior executives at Google actually recently made a announcement in, I think it was part of investor briefing or something. He said that people are not even going to Google Maps to search for restaurants. They go and find on TikTok. And that
Hmm,
completely redefines how we think of consumer experience and search and how we are even interacting with the world around us. So, to come back to your point, have we understood, have companies in the communication space or marketers or even people who are developing product market campaigns, have we really understood how people are interacting with the world? I think that's the larger question. And
hmm,
to the extent that we have the AI based technologies that allow us to understand our customers and what they are really engaging with, and that is where all the image, micro video, all the other the ways in which people are expressing and looking at things around them is changed in just like 10 years.
interesting. Very, very, very interesting. Um, One of the at least popular assistive technology I look at is example Grammarly. But
Hmm.
are there any other assistive technologies that you are aware of? And actually, the more important question there is, from an assistive technologies, there is also certain things that assistive technologies should do and
Mhm.
should not probably need to be more careful from a responsibility standpoint. I would like you to talk a little bit about that, please.
Yeah. And I think talking about assistive technologies, in the one of the things I have been, I think there's a lot of attention is also like, how do you have things like chatbots for the elderly, right? Who are not very savvy with, let's say, technological devices. Um, how about people who have hearing or some visual impairments? Are we developing all our technologies for, what do they say, like people who are abled in a certain way? And
Hmm,
so this is a much broader issue than, of course, there is also, I would say, a generation gap. Probably you and I are kind of on the older side because we are definitely not on TikTok and interacting with influencers and all such.
yes.
So how do we bridge communication across this whole spectrum of people who have different needs, or people who are using technology in ways that are very different from this kind of the very traditional web that was dating back to like the 2000s or something like that, right?
Hmm, hmm,
That I think that's the question. So Grammarly is assistive technology, but I think if you're looking at the whole scope of assistive technologies, it is a lot more, much more of this audience segmentation, recommendation systems. Like, I think they call them, not only the multilingual text to speech options,
hmm,
things that can do like people for how do we help people with some cognitive disabilities, and even I would say just the digital disparities in use of, so how do we bridge that gap? All those could be different aspects. And I think companies like Google have actually done a good job of fantastic job of incorporating sort of the fact that people have widely different needs in how they use technology.
Interesting. Thank you for that. I want to dive a little bit deeper into the trust aspects as
Mhm.
we build AI.
Yeah.
One of the questions that we get asked, uh, because we are building a language assistant,
Hmm.
is why do you even need an AI?
Yes.
Um, because that's probably where the trust question begins in terms of,
Mhm.
okay, why do I need an AI instead of asking a peer or instead of referring to some book, or it would be good to probably start there.
Yeah.
um,
I think the simple reason why we need an AI is just that the variety of choices that we are navigating in today's world is just too big for us to ask a peer. Who is the right peer for what? Right? There's just too
I
much
agree.
content out there. We are just the amount of data that we are generating from like every aspect of our life is just simply skyrocketed. I mean, if you take something like YouTube, they are basically functioning like a historical archive. You can, if you're interested in Indian like old music, you'll find all lots of digitized records on for people who are from South India and they want to learn how to wear a madisar, you're not
Mhm.
going and asking party any longer. You're going and watching some video on YouTube, right? So
Yes.
this is why we need AI assistive technologies, because there's just such a variety of things. Every aspect of our life is digitized, and the choice, the range of things that we have to consider is just tremendously like a exponential choices at every turn. What movie do we want to watch? I don't know. There's like 15 different choices. Who are you? You can ask a friend, but right, where is that element of
They'll
surprise?
have their choices and biases also.
Yes,
They
exactly.
may not know. So
Yeah,
there is other, yeah.
there are other things. So, just to give one example, I don't know if this is I'm not sure this really qualifies as an example of how AI is influencing choices, but this movie RRR, Indian movie, it is a
Mhm.
surprise crossover hit in the US. And
Okay.
I suddenly see what is really interesting for someone like me who's kind of plugged in into social media is like so many of my American friends who have never watched an Indian movie in their life, or maybe they watched something once or twice, they have suddenly discovered this action movie. And in the US, people only watch like the Bruce Lee, or like there's some Asian like action. That genre is very different.
Yeah.
Suddenly people love this movie thanks to Netflix recommendations, right? So I think
Okay.
that's, we just have too many choices in today's world. That's why we need AI to
Got it.
make sense of
Yeah.
the world around us.
Yeah. I mean, even just in the inclusion space, what we face is that there are a lot of inclusion criteria. I mean, there is age, there is gender, there is ethnicity, there is elitism,
Yeah.
and now really you will probably end up asking 50 experts if you really want to get down to the specific issue of how can you create more inclusive content. So also the nuance around the subject itself is also fast evolving, and I
Yes.
think that tech can play a positive role there.
Yeah.
Okay, great. The other aspect about is, okay, once you said that I will use AI, one of the things that is relevant is how effective it is, right? Another,
Mhm.
I mean, the more effective it is,
Yeah.
people can trust it a little bit more. So how do you actually know that an AI is effective? How can one know that this AI is effective?
I mean, it's a question of how you want to integrate like anything like inclusion or fairness. Can we
Mhm.
use it as part of my decision making process somehow within organizations? So I know that sometimes people will say, things like, my client is a startup and they are only interested in, churn or something like that. And they don't have the bandwidth to worry about inclusion, fairness, all those criteria. Well, to the extent that we can monitor and quantify and measure everything, in my opinion, making things more inclusive is also opening new markets. You can retain
Yeah.
great customers. If your employees are put off by something in the communications, there are studies that show that when companies are trying to recruit people, even in the resume screening process, if they are a little bit more careful to be inclusive, that is good. That means those people will actually accept your offer and they'll be satisfied employees. So, to the extent that we can measure and monitor, we can look at what difference does it make? Does it move the needle? Right. And
Yeah.
so it's the burden is on business decision makers to think about. It's not like all this is something, DEI or inclusion. It's like you put it in a box and you say it doesn't matter to my bottom line. I think it very much matters to the bottom line.
Yeah. So that is one aspect that you touched upon is measuring the impact that a technology like this can
Right.
create from an effectiveness point of view. But if
Right.
we come to the core AI itself,
Mhm.
what are some of the key metrics, or what are some of the key areas that AI engineers can track to measure and say, hey, this AI is effective, or the NLP models that you're building is effective?
Well, I mean, the measure of an AI can be multiple things, right? One is just the explainability of an AI system can be an end in itself. If you are providing recommendations to customer, but you're explaining why, that will it's like a intangible capital or something, right? So that is something in itself which is valuable. The other is just making system more transparent. That and sometimes um, we have more regulations, at least parts of like Europe and UK and so forth, where that also is a desired goal in itself. So
Mhm.
it's that can also be, you can measure those things. But I would say that you could look at also performance trade-offs, like yes, the predictive accuracy of the model versus a like little bit more inclusive model.
Mhm.
And there can be different metrics to quantify that as well. There's a lot of fairness in AI type of extensive amount of work has been done by computer science folks and other areas. So if you put a fairer metric, is there some kind of bias reduction, or yes, or am I willing to live with a little bit less predictive accuracy, but in return I'll get something else like intangible capital or some customer goodwill? Then all those decisions can be. And I would say that I would not want to see this as a engineering problem. It's a business problem. The more
Interesting.
AI becomes part of our everyday life, you can't just put it in a box and say that this is something technical, you engineers deal with it.
Yeah.
So in the responsible AI community, we are trying to really get a lot of awareness of ultimately all these are business decisions. And so we cannot detach an AI and just give it to some engineer sitting in the background. It's like you guys build it and then everybody will use it. I think
Yeah.
that is very important.
Got it. Got it. You touched upon fairness. Is Are there any? Can you talk a little bit more about how can you monitor
Mhm.
your AI from a fairness perspective over a long period of time? So.
Yeah, I think this is the thing, especially we see a lot in the banking industry in the US recently. I mean, among other sectors,
Mhm.
banking has done a very good job because in for banks, if you're using some black box AI that is ending up discriminating against groups of customers, then
Mhm.
that's something that is not allowed by the Fair Credit, Fair Lending Act, and there are a bunch
Mhm.
of regulations around that have been already there. Legally, there's a lot of rules that say there's fair employment, equal opportunity, fair credit. These rules have been there for 50 plus years in the United States, even longer, I think.
Yeah.
So the thing though is what has happened in the past decade is everyone's rushing to adopt AI, and I think that we're not, initially at least, people were not asking all these questions. It was like AI is seen as something, it's very efficient, it's prediction, it's automation kind of a thing,
Mhm.
right? And then some of these bad examples started sort of piling up. and companies in the US at least now have to, they're facing some scrutiny from the FTC, Federal Trade Commission, even HUD, Housing and Urban Development. There was actually a lawsuit against Facebook
Hmm.
because Facebook ads allow people to micro target who they're showing ads to.
Mm.
So, and then there were a lot of racial and gender biases. You can exclude showing, in fact, there was something lawsuit against Google where high paying ads were not being shown to women, ads
Interesting.
for high paying jobs.
Okay.
And similarly, there were some exclusionary criteria that were used, like some allowing people to filter out opportunities or housing information about housing by gender and a race and things like that. So those are blatantly, those are what we call algorithmic harm. So we can measure all that. We have rules that say that, with respect to population, is there like some equalized odds, equal opportunity? can we can we just benchmark and say if this ad, the way it's reaching
Hmm.
relative to what the population criteria are and relative to whatever fairness criteria that exists in the organization, because remember that companies do have some internal metrics on what is considered a good practice. So
Hmm.
we can measure and say, is my rule creating more unfairness or bias?
Hmm.
So those all can be measured. All those things can be measured from fairness perspective. And we have also the concept of like equity analytics. In what is, we can look at percentage of hires, we can look at gender distribution, age, all these things, and look at the before and after. Before AI, after AI.
Yeah.
How are my rules changing? That is, it's a question, like it's an auditing problem at that point. And
Correct.
companies have audits. They have done HR audits, they have done accounting audits. So all the existing things, that tools that we already have, can be used to assess the quality of decision making with the AI, right?
Interesting.
So I think my what I would say is, we've treated like AI seems like such a magic. There's so many wonderful things about it. But when we start using AI, it becomes another business problem, and we can use
Hmm.
the same tools. And so I just want to end with, the good thing is that Facebook actually, after this lawsuit and they settled, then recently they made an announcement that they are discontinuing some of those features. So you cannot target the way like people could have. So Facebook has
Okay.
actually changed some of its ad system, the way the ads work.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, interesting. Thank you for sharing that. One of the things about developing these AI systems is to
Mm.
start right at the training data level itself,
Right,
right?
right.
What is it? What are some of the processes or framework or things that
Mhm.
data scientists can do right at the training data level to build a more responsible, trustworthy AI?
So I think in the pre-processing level, that's like before we actually even build the model itself, right? We can use all these. There are pre-processing methods where we could do some relabeling or I think I'll give an example from restaurant reviews, right?
Hmm.
So if you want to build like some kind of a restaurant review recommendation system or something like that, and my
Hmm.
training data is coming from newspaper filings or Wikipedia, it can end up picking up a lot of racist, uh, uh, sort of biases, and
Hmm.
not because the training data is necessarily racist. Remember that all these word embedding methods and language models are looking for association. So
Hmm.
if you use a name of a minority community in connection with crimes, because to some extent newspapers, there's a lot of sensationalism. You talk about one community with, like, say, or drug trafficking, crime. So
Hmm.
AI learns to associate those two words as something negative, right?
Hmm.
And so this was a known problem in the US, right? Some
Hmm.
restaurants, like Italian American restaurants, there's a positive bias. Some restaurants, there's a negative bias. So how do you address this? You can remove the ethnic identifiers by some tokens. before training the data
Okay.
set. And then you have very good ways to, that's a way to debias those negative associations. Same thing actually Google has done with Google image search.
Mm-hmm.
Google blog has excellent examples of how they address gender bias in image search by
Mm-hmm.
basically like they split it into three processes almost, right?
Okay.
So they give the user some level of control as well into like, do you want some desensitized or, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And because I think that the challenge in Google image search and Google Translate especially is
Mm-hmm.
that some languages don't have gendered nouns, some languages have gendered nouns,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? So I think Google, there are problems where if you put, you type doctor, it will show man, and nurse, it will show pictures of
Yes.
women. How do you remove all these? I mean,
Yeah.
there's ways to tokenize, remove those kind of associations. So there's a lot we can do at the pre-processing stage. That is
Got it.
where, right? So there's a lot of fairness metrics, and the good thing is that there are a lot of openly available. Like IBM has a fairness 360. There's Google developed, Google research has a tool called What If. Then there's other A Equitas. Many of these debiasing methods you can use commercial, they're not even commercial, just open source, freely available.
Mhm. Okay.
So companies don't even need to invest a lot of time and money, they can just use fairly existing benchmarks to debias.
Great. Great. Thank you for sharing that. The other question around building trust is around concern for data privacy and security. I would like you to touch upon, what are some of the things that AI engineers can do when you build, especially assistive technologies,
Yeah.
to build care for privacy.
Yeah, I think the challenge with all this privacy, especially security and privacy, is that we are in a world where there's a lot of ad targeting and retargeting.
Hmm.
So, what is a good practice for companies? I think we're still kind of figuring out, right? Um,
Hmm.
and I'm not entirely sure in the Indian context. In US, there are some conversations about data privacy bills that Congress is debating. So that would maybe um, take some control away from technology
Okay.
companies and give some control back to the consumers, because
Yeah.
the question is that for a company, you are collecting a lot of data from a lot of different sources, and some of it, mm, the ad retargeting stuff that's coming from some third party, you don't know what all sources they've employed. So recently in the US, there's actually one of the scandals about data. It's not even, it's almost amusing. There is Canadian donut chain called Tim Hortons,
Hmm.
mostly in the northern part of US. So if you come to any of those Great Lakes areas, Tim Hortons is popular.
Hmm.
And Tim Hortons turns out is collecting a ton of data from customers, and they were collecting data even when people were not on the app. That,
Okay.
so those issues are important, right? Like consent, having established, auditing all those things by
Yeah.
which, where are you collecting customers data from. And Tim Horton is doing so much invasive data collection of the customers. You think they're a donut company, why do they need to do all this? But
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
predictive analytics at work.
Yeah. Even language assistants,
Mhm.
like us, they most of them, they really don't need personal data. I mean, the personal
Yeah.
data has very little to play, a role to play in assisting with language suggestions. So
Yeah.
I could think about that aspect. Um, because this isn't going to be an issue when, let's say, enterprises want to deploy a product,
Yeah.
there will be more greater scrutiny
Yes.
around privacy and security and all of that.
That's
So okay, I get that. Uh, the last question around the whole trust is human in the loop, right?
right.
So what role or where do the human in the loop come in terms of influencing some of this AI, and would love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I think the human in the loop, I think some of the European Union, the regulation guidelines are really good. Um, Especially, I think things like human in the loop is very important when, what we, in my work with companies, what we try to do is have like a heat map of the decision criticality and what
Mhm,
extent we are automating the process. So
mhm.
if you're a company like a Uber or a Ola, where there's some algorithmic performance measurement, right? But the person who is a gig employee or the gig worker, we are basically just asking them to trust. They have to get some job assignment and they'll get some performance, and they don't know how they are being sort of measured or evaluated. So I think that's why in EU requirements they put a right to explanation, and some of those, the human in the loop comes in as well, right? At
Mhm.
what point can we have fully automated decisions? At what point should we at least put some kind of fork in the road and say, for these things, at least you can provide a off ramp, right? Where the
Yeah,
customer says, I want to talk to a person.
yeah,
Can we
yeah,
provide that?
yeah.
Obviously, that goes against, I mean, the reason we want AI is because of the efficiencies and the fact that there's so much,
Yes,
we have so much data. So human in the loop goes against, right? The fact that we can do so much automated. But
yeah.
at least we need some sort of off ramps for things where it's very critical decisions and so forth.
Yeah. Also, in the realm of assistive technologies,
Mhm.
I think AI could offer recommendations and suggestions
Yes.
rather than decisions, and leave the decision to whether accept or do something else entirely to the individual. That probably could be another way of doing it. um, of course, there are more human in the loop that you could build, um, even to start with. What the criteria. It could be around training data. So those are some of the things, at least we try from having human in the loop systems. Great. So I covered almost all the aspects around trust. Thank you for your time. It was great, learning from your experiences. And we wish to talk to you again sometime in the future. Thank you very much, Anjana.
Thank
Bye
you. It was very
bye.
good conversation. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.